Simon McRae, the National Manager of Ethical Clothing Australia. Ethical Clothing Australia is a national certification body that can help you identify socially sustainable manufacturers. ECA has a variety of manufacturers that are certified with them, and rather than bring them all in tonight, we thought Simon could provide you with an overview. Simon has a strong background in the other end of the supply chain, having worked in Bangladesh on social justice issues for a number of years. So I'll let him take the stage. Thanks, Simon.
Right, okay. Good slide. Thanks everyone for coming today. I'll just sort of briefly go through what ECA does, and feel free to ask questions. I presume there's people here that are very interested in fashion. And sort of basically what we're about really, ECA is essentially an accreditation body. We certify clothing and footwear chains in Australia to make sure that they're complying with the law in terms of workers' rights and conditions. And we also promote those brands as well. So we try to create a market for ethical clothing in Australia. And effectively it's all built around the Home Workers Code, which was set up in the 1990s. And for those people who are familiar with fashion, we, when the tariffs were cut in Australia in the 1990s, and we had like 200,000 people working in Australia before then, once we cut those import tariffs, we obviously had a flood of cheap imports into Australia. A lot of the industry went offshore. A lot of it was outsourced and it ended up in home work, and it was there where the exploitation started to occur. So there was a code of practice set up by the industry, and that's really what we work to implement. And that's just some of the issues that we get with home work, and also just generally about exploitation in the clothing sector. So I just wanted to concentrate really on the aspects of what the principles of ethical sourcing really are. And it kind of overlaps with what Dana was saying, because there's always common overlap with all those different schemes. First one is multi-stakeholder. That is get everyone in the tent, because you've got, if you start excluding people, then you're going to have a credibility problem from the start. It means that everything's slower. It means that everything can be a bit painful at times. It means you have to have lots of discussions, but it's better to have everyone, or as many people in the tent as you can. The second thing is transparency, because if people are suspicious about what you're doing, then you really need to demonstrate that you've got nothing to hide. And the third thing is independent monitoring, which really is quite critical. And having worked in codes of conduct and codes of practice in the clothing sector and food sector overseas, you can see what happens when you don't get that right. And Rana Plaza is a classic example of what happens when you sign up for a code of conduct that isn't actually properly monitored, which, for those people who aren't aware, Rana Plaza was the garment factory that collapsed in Bangladesh last year and killed over 1,000 people. So really what we do in a nutshell is we just map the supply chain. So we actually go out and try and find where your suppliers are, make sure they're compliant if you sign up for accreditation, and you work your way through the supply chain and you try and make people compliant. There's no penalty in it in the sense if you find people that aren't legally compliant, you try and work with them to make sure they are compliant, and that's the kind of journey you go on with the applicants. It's pretty straightforward. You pay a fee based on how much, whether you outsource, how many employees you've got, what your turnover is. There's compliance audits undertaken by the Textile, Clothing and Footwear Union, who are part of the management committee. There's also paperwork that's got to be filled in. A lot of it's just actual legal paperwork, which you already have, which is wages, proof of super payments, etc. And then hopefully you'll get approved, which generally happens. So it's a voluntary thing, you don't have to do it. I think one of the great things about codes of practice, as opposed to law, is you can start off at a minimum level of behaviour, and then you can do whatever you want beyond that. We're constrained by the law. Some people get a bit frustrated about some of the aspects of accreditation. Unfortunately, we're constrained by what the law tells us we can do. But the accreditation process itself is actually voluntary. The law, of course, isn't voluntary, and that's what we're trying to get you to understand and comply with. And there's various sort of resources we have which to help you in terms of being compliant. this is just a little bit of background comparing Australia with what goes on overseas. I used to work with a development agency in the UK that worked with Bangladeshi garment workers, so I'm very familiar with what the conditions are like. They're pretty full on, you know, like a lot of clothing that people would buy in Australia would come from Bangladesh or India or China. I'm not saying you should boycott it, because that's not going to help anyone, certainly not going to help young women who are working in those factories. But the conditions are pretty exploitative, to put it mildly. Very low wages, long working hours, locked exits, one toilet per floor, not enough water, not really eating properly, and having to go home and share a house with a whole lot of other people, send money back to your family, and there's a whole lot of people relying on your wage, there's a lot of pressure on you, and so it's very easy to be exploited. And that was just I think it's always worth reminding people of what actually happened last year. We had the biggest single garment worker accident in history of the garment industry. It was absolutely horrendous. There were brands from all over the world sourcing from this factory, and it's just an example of what happens when you don't actually do things properly, when you keep cutting costs, because cheap fashion is basically exploitation. It's got nothing to do with economies of scale. You can't make pairs of jeans for $5 or $10 and not tell anyone that you're actually exploiting people. So I think we've got to be real about how cheap you can make things. So there's a whole lot of people can look at this, but there's a whole lot of risk when you source from overseas, and that is you have less control over the process. The standards are lower. You have less influence. There's no collective voice for workers to speak out. They're too scared to say if anything's wrong. So you, as a brand, have got a hell of a lot more responsibility. You cannot rely on the government and say, oh, well, it was the government's fault that that building collapsed in Bangladesh. Yeah, of course, there was no one really doing inspections. The building was built to really poor standards. That's fine, but that's not going to cut it with your customers when they find out that you're sourcing from those places. And that's why it's really important to have a robust accreditation scheme behind what you do. So, onto the positive things. What the benefits of accreditation from an ECA point of view is that you can promote yourself as an ethical brand, and I think this is really important in terms of where Australian fashion sits, because for us, being able to promote Australian fashion as sustainable, ethically made, high quality, I think is going to be the future for the success of the fashion industry, because it gives us a point of difference. And obviously we've got great designers and people are really creative, and that's all part of it as well. But all those cultures mixing into Australia, which make it really interesting as well and make it exciting in terms of fashion. We're never going to compete on the cheap end of the scale. We can help you understand what your legal obligations are. We can help identify and manage risks in the supply chain. It's not required for Commonwealth government contracts, but we do know that the government procurement officers do like brands that are accredited because they feel more safe in terms of choosing them. You can recruit staff, but also the other thing I didn't add there is we're now doing a lot more work in terms of referrals, trying to refer people. So if you're a designer looking to do work in Australia, you want to get stuff made in Australia, we can help connect you with other accredited manufacturers and other suppliers. I think this is the important thing. Now we've got a good pool of people who are accredited and suppliers underneath those brands who are accredited. We can do a lot more stuff in terms of trying to keep industry on shore, which is really what we want to do. And they're just obviously the risks if you're not accredited, which are pretty obvious. Protests, reputational damage, economic loss because customers don't support you, difficulty attracting investment, staff aren't as motivated, obviously. So all the negatives that come with not being caught out, basically. Now, ethically made, walk the talk. This really goes back to what Daniel said. I've worked in lots of codes of conduct and schemes in different forms in different parts of the world, and the common thing that comes out of it is you've got to really be able to walk the talk. There's no point having a code of conduct that doesn't have those core elements of stakeholder buy-in, transparency, and independent monitoring. You're going to get found out. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the clothing codes of conduct is that they don't have enough key stakeholders. That's the first problem. They'll often have a good base code or code of practice, but the monitoring is just non-existent. I mean, someone comes in and does an order for 2 days in a factory and says, I've seen everything, and walks out. Workers don't tell everything that goes out, which never gets picked up and never monitored. We follow the supply chain right down to the last homework, and no matter how many times it cascades out of our workplace, how many tiers it goes through, we keep going until we get to the end. A lot of those big codes of practice just don't do that, so that's where they fall apart. And then there's all the benefits of promoting ethical fashion, and obviously we've got our website and social media is fantastic because you can do so much now, and younger brands are much better at using social media. And you can go onto the website, you've got a consumer corner, and you can look at all the brands, and look at some of the brands in Melbourne, and I've probably left some out, so definitely complain to me afterwards. But there's lots of diversity there really, because you've got people doing things like New Body Beauty Queen does lots of different, can make for other people as well as do their own products. You've got people who specialise in schoolwear, you've got people who specialise in shirt making, underwear, outdoor wear, fashion. You know, there's just so much happening in Melbourne. Melbourne's incredibly creative in terms of businesses and in terms of what it's doing in this space. So lots of support, and if you're a designer, you can go onto our website, you can learn about training, you can learn about, and you can find out about if you want to make stuff in Australia, where you can go to get other people who can help you out in that process. And finally, my plug is just to give us some, we've got a federal government funding cut, and so we're just actually out there trying to advocate for people to support a campaign we set up to raise funding, raise the aid. We're currently surviving off our fees and reserves that we have and other sources of income, but we're obviously trying to keep the accreditation body going because we think it's important for Australia, for the industry to have a body that's credible, but also promoting fashion and keeping it going in Australia. And that's it really. Thanks very much.